When Viviane Nakamura, a 42-year-old African immigrant working as a housekeeper in Manhattan's Upper East Side, was thrown out of billionaire Ivandro Rothschild's penthouse without her final paycheck of $3,000. She had no idea that in exactly 72 hours she would be sitting across from him at Goldman Sachs, closing a deal worth $340 million that would transform her from a woman sleeping in subway stations to the most powerful financial advisor on Wall Street. How did a woman who cleaned toilets for $15 an hour become the savior of America's largest investment firm? And why did she keep her Harvard MBA and 20 years of international banking experience secret, while scrubbing floors in the homes of people who treated her as invisible? This is the story of Viviane Nakamura, the African housekeeper who spoke 9 languages fluently, held 3 master's degrees, and had managed billion-dollar portfolios in Switzerland before losing everything in a family tragedy that forced her to start over in America with nothing but the clothes on her back and an unbreakable faith that God had not forgotten her purpose. In just 6 months, Viviane went from earning $1,800 a month cleaning houses to commanding a salary of $400,000 annually, plus bonuses that reached $2.3 million last quarter alone, proving that the greatest mistake of the powerful is underestimating those they cannot see beyond their own prejudice. But before we reveal how Viviane transformed her life and shocked an entire industry, let me share something that will change how you see every struggle in your own life. Every person watching this right now has been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed by someone who thought they knew your worth based on what they could see. Every person has felt invisible, unheard, powerless in the face of people who seem to hold all the cards. But what you're about to witness in Viviane's story will prove that your current circumstances are not your final destination, that your struggles are preparing you for something greater than you can imagine, and that sometimes God allows you to be knocked down, so that when you rise, the entire world will have no choice but to notice the power that was always inside you. The morning that changed everything started like every other morning for Viviane Nakamura. At 4:30 a.m., she woke up in the cramped basement room she rented for $800 a month in Queens, a room so small she could touch both walls with her arms extended, with a single window that faced a brick wall and let in no natural light. The radiator clanged like a broken machine, and the ceiling leaked every time it rained, forcing her to place buckets around her bed to catch the water that dripped steadily through the night. She had been living in this room for 8 months, ever since arriving in New York City with nothing but a suitcase containing 3 dresses, a small Bible that belonged to her late mother, and a heart full of hope that America would give her the chance to rebuild the life that had been destroyed in one terrible night in Lagos. As Viviane prepared for another day of cleaning houses for people who rarely looked at her face when giving instructions, she had no idea that this Tuesday, October 15th, would be the day her life changed forever. She dressed carefully in the same black uniform she wore every day, a simple dress with long sleeves that covered the scar on her left arm from the night her family's compound was attacked, the night that took everything from her and forced her to flee the only country she had ever known. She pinned her hair back in a tight bun, applied no makeup because she had learned that being invisible was safer than being noticed, and ate a breakfast of instant oatmeal and black coffee while reading a chapter from Psalms, a ritual that gave her strength to face another day of being treated as less than human by people who had no idea they were speaking to someone who once managed the international accounts of 3 African governments. By 5:45 a.m., Viviane was standing on the subway platform in Queens, holding the worn leather briefcase that contained her cleaning supplies and the only evidence of her former life, documents she carried everywhere because they were the only proof that she had once been Dr. Viviane Nakamura, Senior Vice President of International Development at Swiss Banking Corporation, a woman who had advised presidents and prime ministers, who had spoken at economic summits in Geneva and London, who had been featured on the cover of African Business magazine as one of the continent's most influential financial minds. But in America, she was just another black woman with an accent who cleaned other people's dirt, and she had learned not to mention her education or experience because it only made employers suspicious and uncomfortable. The subway car was crowded with the early morning rush of workers heading into Manhattan, and Viviane stood pressed against the window, watching the darkness give way to dawn as the train emerged from the tunnel and crossed into the city. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, the same prayer she had said every morning for 8 months. Dear God, I know you have not forgotten me. I know this is not where my story ends. Give me strength to endure whatever comes today, and help me remember that you are preparing me for something greater than I can see. Use my pain for your purpose, and let my faith be stronger than my fear. She opened her eyes as the train pulled into her station, gathered her briefcase and the small bag that contained her lunch, and stepped onto the platform to begin another day in the life she was living, while waiting for the life God intended her to have. Evandro Rothschild's penthouse occupied the entire 42nd floor of a building that overlooked Central Park, a monument to wealth so excessive it seemed almost obscene. The apartment had 12 rooms, including a library with first edition books he had never read, a wine cellar with bottles worth more than most people earned in a year, and a master bathroom larger than most New York apartments, with marble imported from Italy and fixtures plated in actual gold. Evandro had inherited this wealth from his grandfather, who had built a financial empire through a combination of brilliance, ruthlessness, and what some whispered were connections to people who laundered money for organizations that operated outside the law. At 45, Evandro had never worked a day in his life in the way most people understood work, never worried about paying rent or buying groceries, never felt the fear of not knowing where his next meal would come from. This morning, Evandro was in a particularly foul mood because his investment firm, Rothschild Capital Management, was facing the worst crisis in its 70-year history. 3 major clients had pulled their accounts in the past month, taking with them over $200 million in assets under management. The Securities and Exchange Commission was investigating irregularities in their international trading division, and rumors were spreading through Wall Street that the firm might be forced to close by the end of the year. Evandro's personal net worth had dropped from $1.2 billion to $800 million in the past 6 months, a loss that would have been devastating to anyone else but merely made him angry because it threatened the lifestyle he considered his birthright. When Viviane arrived at the penthouse at 7 a.m., using the service elevator that domestic workers were required to use, she could immediately sense the tension in the apartment. Evandro was shouting into his phone in the living room, his voice echoing off the marble floors and crystal chandeliers, as he berated someone about quarterly projections and client retention. His wife, Regina, was in the kitchen drinking her 3rd glass of wine despite the early hour, her face puffy from the cosmetic procedures she underwent regularly to maintain the appearance of youth. Their teenage son, Bradford, was in his room playing video games with the volume turned up loud enough to disturb the neighbors, if there had been any neighbors close enough to be disturbed in this exclusive building, where each floor contained only 1 apartment. Viviane began her work in the kitchen, quietly clearing away the mess from the family's breakfast, washing dishes that cost more individually than she earned in a week, wiping down countertops made from marble that had been quarried in Greece and shipped to New York, at a cost that could have fed a village in Africa for a year. She worked with the quiet efficiency she had perfected over 8 months of domestic service, moving through the apartment like a ghost, invisible to the family whose problems seemed so large to them, but so small compared to the real suffering she had witnessed and experienced. As she cleaned, Viviane could hear fragments of Evandro's phone conversations, and her trained ear caught details that revealed the true scope of his company's problems. She heard him mention LIBOR manipulation, regulatory violations, and client funds that had been invested in instruments that violated fiduciary guidelines. Her financial background allowed her to understand immediately that Rothschild Capital Management was not just facing a cash flow problem or a temporary downturn in the market, but was potentially involved in practices that could result in criminal charges and the complete collapse of the firm. She continued cleaning while processing this information, her mind automatically calculating the implications and possible solutions, habits from her former career that she could not turn off even while scrubbing someone else's bathtub. By 10 a.m., Viviane had finished cleaning the main living areas and moved to Evandro's home office, a room that served as his private sanctuary, where he conducted business away from the chaos of his family life. The office was dominated by a massive mahogany desk that had belonged to his grandfather, surrounded by walls lined with degrees from Harvard and Wharton, photographs of Evandro shaking hands with politicians and celebrities, and awards from industry organizations that recognized his contributions to international finance. As Viviane dusted the bookshelves, she noticed that many of the financial texts were books she had studied in graduate school, theories and strategies she had implemented in her previous career when she managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She was cleaning the window behind Evandro's desk when she noticed a document that had been left open on his computer screen, a financial report that detailed the exact nature of his company's crisis. Without meaning to invade his privacy, she could not help but see the numbers displayed on the monitor, and what she saw made her pause in her cleaning. The report showed that Rothschild Capital Management had a potential liability of over $400 million related to investments in Eastern European bonds that had been purchased with client funds but were now in default. The company had hidden these losses by moving them between subsidiary accounts, a practice that violated federal regulations and could result in both civil and criminal penalties. But what caught Viviane's attention was not the magnitude of the problem, but the fact that she recognized the specific bonds mentioned in the report. During her time at Swiss Banking Corporation, she had worked extensively with Eastern European sovereign debt, and she knew that while these particular bonds were currently in default, there was a restructuring plan that had been approved by the International Monetary Fund that would allow bondholders to recover approximately 80% of their investment if they participated in a debt swap program that was scheduled to begin in the next 60 days. The problem was that this information was not widely known in the American financial community because the negotiations had been conducted in Russian and Polish, languages that most Wall Street analysts did not speak. Viviane stood frozen behind Evandro's desk, staring at the computer screen that displayed information she was not supposed to see, holding knowledge that could potentially save his company from bankruptcy and criminal prosecution. The irony was overwhelming that she, the African woman he paid $15 an hour to clean his toilet, possessed information worth hundreds of millions of dollars to the man who treated her as if she were furniture. For a moment, she considered saying nothing, allowing the natural consequences of his arrogance and the systemic injustices she faced every day to play out as they would. But her faith would not allow her to stand by and watch anyone suffer when she had the power to help, even someone who had shown her nothing but indifference and casual cruelty. She was still standing there, wrestling with this moral dilemma, when Evandro burst into his office in a state of panic that she had never seen before. His usually perfectly styled hair was disheveled, his tie was loosened, and his face was red with the kind of stress that comes from facing the complete destruction of everything you have built your identity around. He was followed by his personal assistant, Augusta Fleming, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s who had worked for the Rothschild family for 6 years and was one of the few people who knew the full extent of their financial problems. Augusta was speaking rapidly into her phone, trying to schedule an emergency meeting with the firm's lawyers, while Evandro slumped into his chair and buried his head in his hands. Neither of them acknowledged Viviane's presence as she continued dusting the bookshelf, treating her with the casual invisibility that had characterized their interactions for the 8 months she had been cleaning their home. To them, she was no different from the furniture or the expensive art on the walls, a functional object that served a purpose, but had no thoughts, feelings, or opinions worth considering. That's when Evandro's phone rang with a call that would change everything. The caller was Marcus Steinberg, the senior partner at Goldman Sachs who had been handling Rothschild Capital's accounts for the past 15 years. Marcus's voice was loud enough that Viviane could hear both sides of the conversation as she continued her cleaning, moving closer to the desk while pretending to organize the papers on a side table. Marcus's message was devastating and final. Goldman Sachs was immediately freezing all credit lines to Rothschild Capital Management, pending a full investigation of their Eastern European investments. The Securities and Exchange Commission had issued a preliminary report that suggested potential fraud, and Goldman's Risk Management Committee had voted unanimously to sever all relationships with the firm. Furthermore, Marcus continued, Goldman would be required to notify all other major investment banks of their decision. effectively blacklisting Rothschild capital from the entire Wall Street financial community. Evandro listened to this news with the expression of a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. When Marcos finished speaking, there was a long silence before Evandro asked in a voice barely above a whisper how much time he had before the information became public. Marcos's answer was like a death sentence. The announcement would be made at the close of trading that day, giving Evandro approximately 6 hours to find a solution or watch his family's 70-year financial legacy disappear forever. After Evandro hung up the phone, he sat staring at his computer screen, where the same financial report that Viviane had seen was still displayed. Augusta approached his desk cautiously, having heard enough of the conversation to understand that their situation had moved from serious to catastrophic. She began suggesting various desperate measures, contacting other investment banks, liquidating personal assets, even considering bankruptcy as a way to protect whatever could be saved from the wreckage. But Evandro was not listening to Augusta's suggestions. He was staring at the numbers on his screen with the look of a man who had finally accepted that he was facing a problem that could not be solved by money, influence, or connections. For the first time in his life, he was completely powerless, dependent on forces beyond his control, experiencing the same helplessness that people like Viviane lived with every day, but that he had never imagined could touch someone of his wealth and status. That's when Viviane made a decision that would change not only her life, but the lives of everyone in that room. She set down her cleaning cloth, walked over to Evandro's desk, and spoke for the first time in 8 months, other than to say good morning or goodbye. Her voice was quiet but clear, with a slight accent that revealed her African origins, but also carried an authority that made both Evandro and Augusta look up in surprise. "Excuse me, Mr. Rothschild," she said, standing with her hands clasped in front of her like a student addressing a teacher. "But I could not help overhearing your conversation about the Eastern European bonds. I believe I may have information that could be helpful to your situation." The two of them stared at her as if a piece of furniture had suddenly begun speaking, their faces showing a mixture of shock and confusion that their housekeeper had not only been listening to their private business discussions, but apparently understood them well enough to offer assistance. Evandro's first reaction was anger at what he perceived as an intrusion by someone who had no right to involve herself in his private affairs. "Who do you think you are?" he snapped, his voice harsh with a kind of contempt he showed to people he considered beneath his notice. "This is a private conversation about matters that are none of your business. Go back to your cleaning and pretend you heard nothing, or you can find yourself another job today." Augusta nodded in agreement, her expression showing disapproval that the help had overstepped their boundaries so dramatically. But Viviane did not retreat or apologize as they expected. Instead, she took a step closer to the desk and spoke again, this time with a confidence that surprised even herself. "Mr. Rothschild, I understand that you have no reason to listen to me, but I have extensive experience with Eastern European sovereign debt restructuring, and I believe the bonds mentioned in your report are eligible for a debt swap program that could recover 80% of your investment. The program begins accepting applications in 57 days, and bondholders who participate will receive new instruments backed by International Monetary Fund guarantees." The room fell completely silent as Evandro and Augusta processed what they had just heard. The specific details Viviane had mentioned were not public information, and the fact that she knew about IMF guarantees and debt swap programs suggested a level of financial expertise that seemed impossible for someone in her position. Evandro's anger began to give way to curiosity as he realized that his housekeeper had just demonstrated knowledge of international finance that his own analysts might not possess. "How could you possibly know about debt restructuring programs?" Augusta asked, her voice carrying suspicion but also a hint of hope that someone in the room might actually have a solution to their catastrophic problem. Viviane took a deep breath before answering, knowing that what she was about to reveal would change everything between her and these people who had treated her as invisible for 8 months. "Because before I came to America, I was Senior Vice President of International Development at Swiss Banking Corporation, where I managed sovereign debt portfolios worth over $2 billion for African and Eastern European governments. I have a Master of Business Administration from Harvard Business School. a Master of International Economics from the London School of Economics, and 22 years of experience in international finance, including 5 years specializing in debt restructuring for emerging market economies. I speak 9 languages, including Russian and Polish, which is how I know about the IMF program that was negotiated in meetings that most American analysts cannot access, because they do not have the language skills to participate in the discussions. The silence that followed this revelation was so complete that the only sound in the room was the ticking of the antique grandfather clock that stood in the corner of Evandro's office. Both Evandro and Augusta stared at Viviane, as if seeing her for the first time, their minds struggling to reconcile the image they had of her as a simple housekeeper with the professional credentials and expertise she had just described. The cognitive dissonance was so extreme that for a moment neither of them could formulate a response. Evandro was the first to speak, his voice uncertain in a way that Viviane had never heard before. "If what you're saying is true," he said slowly, "then why are you working as a housekeeper? Why didn't you tell us about your background when you started working here?" The questions carried an undertone of accusation, as if Viviane had somehow deceived them by not revealing her qualifications for a job that required no qualifications beyond the willingness to clean other people's homes. Viviane's response came from a place of pain that she had kept buried for 8 months. The accumulated hurt of being treated as less than human by people who never bothered to ask about her life, her dreams, her story. Because when I arrived in America 8 months ago, I applied for over 200 positions in investment banking, asset management, and international finance. I sent my resume to every major firm on Wall Street, along with letters of recommendation from former colleagues and clients. Do you know how many interviews I received? 0. Do you know why? Because when hiring managers saw my African name, saw that I was a refugee who had fled political violence in Nigeria, they decided I was not the kind of person who belonged in their world. She paused, her voice growing stronger as she continued to speak truths that she had never said aloud before. I took this job cleaning houses because I needed to survive while I figured out how to rebuild my career in a country where my 22 years of experience meant nothing, because I did not have connections or a network of people who looked like me in positions of power. I cleaned your toilets and scrubbed your floors while I studied American financial regulations at night, while I learned the differences between Swiss banking law and American securities law, while I prepared myself for opportunities that never came because no one would give me the chance to prove what I could do. Augusta was staring at Viviane with an expression of dawning comprehension, beginning to understand the full implications of what had just been revealed. "You're telling us that you've been cleaning our house for 8 months while you're more qualified than most of the people working at our firm," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of amazement and something that might have been shame. Viviane nodded, her composure beginning to crack as 8 months of suppressed frustration and humiliation rose to the surface. "I have managed larger portfolios than your entire company overseas. I have advised governments on fiscal policy and debt management. I have testified before parliamentary committees in 3 countries about international monetary policy. But in America, I am just another black woman with an accent who is lucky to have work cleaning your bathrooms. You pay me $15 an hour to do work that I could teach graduate courses about, and you never once asked me who I was before I became your housekeeper." The room was charged with an energy that none of them had expected, a confrontation with assumptions and prejudices that had been invisible until this moment. Evandro was struggling to process not only the revelation of Viviane's qualifications, but the uncomfortable realization that he had spent 8 months treating someone as a servant who was more educated and experienced than he was. The cognitive dissonance was painful, forcing him to confront his own assumptions about race, class, and worth in ways that challenged everything he believed about himself and his place in the world. But beyond the personal embarrassment was a more immediate concern. If Viviane truly had the expertise she claimed, she might be the only person in the room who could save his company from complete destruction. The debt swap program she had mentioned could be the solution that would allow Rothschild Capital Management to avoid bankruptcy and criminal prosecution, but only if she was willing to help them, and only if her information was accurate and current. Evandro looked directly at Viviane for what felt like the first time since she had started working in his home, seeing not the invisible housekeeper, but the accomplished professional she had always been. "Can you prove what you're telling us?" he asked, his voice carrying a mixture of desperation and hope. "Can you show us documentation of this debt swap program? And do you really believe it could solve our problem with the Eastern European bonds?" Viviane walked over to where she had left her cleaning supplies and retrieved the worn leather briefcase that she carried with her every day. From inside the briefcase, she pulled out a manila folder that contained documents she had printed from financial databases she still had access to through her professional memberships, information about the debt restructuring program that most American investors knew nothing about, because the negotiations had been conducted in languages they did not speak and reported in publications they did not read. She spread the documents across Evandro's desk, pointing out the specific terms of the program, the timeline for applications, and the requirements for participation. As she explained the technical details, her voice took on the authority and confidence of someone who had spent decades working in international finance, someone who understood not just the mechanics of debt restructuring, but the political and economic forces that made such programs necessary and effective. "The program is administered jointly by the International Monetary Fund and the European Central Bank," she explained, pointing to specific sections of the documents. "Bondholders who participate will exchange their defaulted instruments for new bonds with IMF guarantees, accepting a 20% haircut in exchange for full payment security. The application period begins in 57 days and closes 60 days later, so there is a very narrow window for participation, but companies that qualify and submit proper documentation will be able to recover 80% of their investment within 90 days of program completion." As Evandro and Augusta studied the documents, they began to understand that Viviane had not only identified a potential solution to their crisis, but had access to information and expertise that could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars to their company. The debt swap program was exactly what they needed to resolve their Eastern European bond exposure. But without Viviane's knowledge of its existence and the specific requirements for participation, they never would have known about the opportunity. But there was a problem that became apparent as they discussed the technical requirements of the program. The application process required extensive documentation in Russian and Polish, languages that no one at Rothschild Capital Management spoke fluently. Furthermore, the program required applicants to demonstrate a comprehensive understanding of Eastern European monetary policy and sovereign debt structures, expertise that their current staff did not possess. Without someone who could navigate both the linguistic and technical requirements of the program, they would be unable to participate, even though they now knew it existed. That's when Augusta asked the question that would change everything. "Ms. Nakamura," she said, using Viviane's last name for the first time since they had met, "would you be willing to help us prepare the application for this program? We would compensate you appropriately for your time and expertise, of course." The question hung in the air between them, representing a fundamental shift in the power dynamic that had defined their relationship for 8 months. Viviane looked at these two people who had treated her as invisible, who had never asked her name or shown interest in her life beyond her ability to clean their home, who were now desperate for her help to save their company and their fortune. She thought about all the mornings she had woken up in her basement room, all the times she had been spoken to as if she were stupid or lazy, all the applications she had submitted that were ignored because of assumptions about her background and qualifications. But she also thought about her faith, about the prayer she said every morning asking God to use her skills and experience for a purpose greater than her current circumstances. She thought about her mother's Bible and the lessons about forgiveness and redemption that had sustained her through the darkest period of her life. She thought about the possibility that perhaps all of her suffering had been preparation for this moment, this opportunity to demonstrate not just her professional competence but her character and integrity. "I will help you," she said quietly, "but I have conditions that are not negotiable. First, you will pay me as a financial consultant, not as domestic help. My rate is $500 per hour for this type of specialized work, which is below market rate for someone with my qualifications, but reflects the urgent nature of your situation. Second, if we are successful in recovering your funds through this program, I want a permanent position with your firm as Senior Vice President of International Development, with a salary commensurate with my experience and qualifications. Third, you will provide a letter of recommendation acknowledging my role in saving your company, which I can use to rebuild my career in American finance. Evandro and Augusta exchanged glances, both understanding that they were in no position to negotiate. Their company was hours away from being publicly destroyed, and Viviane represented their only hope of survival. Her conditions were reasonable given her qualifications and the value of her assistance, but more than that, they were fair in a way that their treatment of her had never been. Agreed, Evandro said without hesitation. When can you start? And what do you need from us to prepare the application? Viviane looked at the clock on the wall and calculated quickly in her head. The Goldman Sachs announcement would be made in 5 hours, but if they could get preliminary documentation to the debt swap program administrators before the public announcement, it might be possible to expedite their application and avoid the negative publicity that would come with being publicly blacklisted from Wall Street. I need access to all documentation related to your Eastern European bond purchases, including original purchase agreements, current valuations, and any correspondence with the bond issuers, she said, her voice taking on the crisp efficiency of someone who had managed similar crises before. I also need a workspace with a computer, phone, and access to international financial databases. Most importantly, I need you to trust me completely and follow my instructions without question, because we have very little time and no room for mistakes. Augusta immediately began gathering the requested documents while Evandro cleared his personal office for Viviane to use as a command center. As they worked, the fundamental dynamic between them shifted completely. No longer was Viviane the invisible housekeeper who cleaned around them while they conducted their business. Now she was the expert professional whose knowledge and experience represented their only chance of survival. And they hung on her every word as she explained what needed to be done. Over the next 4 hours, Viviane worked with an intensity and focus that impressed both Evandro and Augusta. She reviewed hundreds of pages of financial documents, identifying exactly which bonds were eligible for the debt swap program and calculating the precise recovery amounts they could expect. She drafted application letters in Russian and Polish, languages she had learned during her graduate studies and perfected during her years working with Eastern European governments. She made phone calls to contacts in Switzerland, London, and Moscow, people who remembered her reputation from her previous career and were willing to expedite processing for someone they respected and trusted. But most importantly, she demonstrated a level of professional competence and leadership that neither Evandro nor Augusta had expected. She took charge of the situation with quiet authority, organizing their efforts with the efficiency of someone who had managed similar crises before, making decisions quickly and confidently based on her deep understanding of international finance and her experience with bureaucratic processes that could make or break their application. As the deadline for the Goldman Sachs announcement approached, Viviane was on the phone with Elena Volkov, the program director at the International Monetary Fund, who would be reviewing their application. The conversation was conducted entirely in Russian, and Evandro and Augusta could only watch as Viviane negotiated terms and timelines that would determine the fate of their company. Her voice carried the authority of someone who was comfortable operating at the highest levels of international finance, someone who understood not just the technical requirements, but the political considerations that influenced how such programs were administered. When Viviane hung up the phone, she turned to face Evandro and Augusta with an expression that revealed nothing about the outcome of her conversation. For a moment, the room was silent as they waited for her to speak, their futures hanging on whatever news she was about to deliver. "We have been accepted into the expedited review process," she announced, her voice calm despite the magnitude of what she had just accomplished. "Miss Volkov has agreed to process our application within 72 hours instead of the normal 30-day review period, but only because I was able to provide documentation that proves our bonds meet the specific criteria for emergency consideration. If our paperwork is approved, we will receive confirmation of program participation before the end of the week, and fund recovery will begin immediately thereafter." The relief in the room was palpable, but Viviane was not finished. However, she continued, there is one condition that Ms. Volkov has imposed. Because of the expedited timeline, she requires a personal guarantee from someone with established credentials in international finance. She needs assurance that our application has been prepared by someone who understands the program requirements and can be held accountable for the accuracy of our submissions. I have provided my professional references and agreed to serve as your representative throughout the process. Ivandro looked at this woman who 8 hours earlier had been cleaning his bathroom and who was now personally guaranteeing the recovery of $400 million of his company's assets. The transformation was so complete that he struggled to reconcile the two versions of Viviane that existed in his mind. But more than that, he was beginning to understand the full implications of what had happened, not just the financial salvation she had provided, but the moral lesson her story represented about assumptions, prejudice, and the danger of judging people based on their circumstances rather than their character and capabilities. 2 hours later, Marcus Steinberg called to deliver the news that Goldman Sachs was postponing their public announcement, pending new information about Rothschild Capital's Eastern European exposure. Somehow, word had reached the Risk Management Committee that the bonds in question might be eligible for IMF-guaranteed recovery, information that changed their assessment of the company's financial stability. Marcus wanted to schedule an emergency meeting to discuss the situation and potentially reverse Goldman's decision to freeze credit lines and blacklist the firm. As Ivandro arranged the meeting with Goldman Sachs, Augusta approached Viviane with an expression of genuine remorse. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice carrying the weight of 8 months of assumptions and misconceptions. "We treated you terribly, not because you did anything wrong, but because we never bothered to see who you really were. I'm embarrassed by how we behaved, and I want you to know that it had nothing to do with your worth as a person and everything to do with our own limitations and prejudices." Viviane looked at Augusta with compassion rather than anger, understanding that prejudice often comes from ignorance rather than malice, and that people can change when they are confronted with evidence that challenges their assumptions. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "I don't tell you my story to make you feel guilty, but to help you understand that everyone you meet has a story, has dignity, has something valuable to contribute if you give them the chance. The woman who cleans your office might be a former teacher. The man who delivers your food might be a former engineer. We are all more than our current circumstances, and we all deserve to be treated with respect, regardless of what job we do or where we come from." 3 days later, Viviane walked into Goldman Sachs wearing a navy blue business suit she had not worn since her last day at Swiss Banking Corporation 8 months earlier. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who belonged in these halls of financial power, someone who had earned the right to sit at tables where decisions affecting millions of dollars were made. The transformation from invisible housekeeper to respected financial advisor was complete. But more than her external appearance had changed. She had reclaimed not just her professional identity, but her sense of self-worth and purpose. The meeting at Goldman Sachs lasted 3 hours, during which Viviane presented the debt swap program documentation to a room full of senior partners and risk management executives who had never seen anything like the solution she had developed. Her presentation was flawless, demonstrating not only her technical expertise, but her ability to communicate complex financial concepts to people who were experts in their field, but unfamiliar with the specific area of Eastern European sovereign debt restructuring. When the presentation was finished, Marcus Steinberg stood and addressed the room with words that would be remembered by everyone present. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we have just witnessed something remarkable. Miss Nakamura has not only identified a solution that will save Rothschild Capital Management from bankruptcy, but she has done so with a level of professionalism and expertise that exceeds anything I have seen in my 30 years on Wall Street. Goldman Sachs is not only reversing our decision to freeze credit lines, but we are also offering Ms. Nakamura a position as Managing Director of our International Sovereign Debt Division, with a starting salary of $600,000 annually, plus performance bonuses." The offer from Goldman Sachs represented more than just professional recognition. It was validation of everything Viviane had worked for throughout her career. acknowledgement that her expertise and experience had value in the American financial community. But even as she felt gratitude for the opportunity, Viviane knew that her decision about the Goldman Sachs offer would send a message about loyalty, integrity, and keeping commitments, even when better opportunities arise. "Thank you, Mr. Steinberg," she said, standing to address the room with the same quiet authority she had demonstrated throughout the presentation. "Your offer is incredibly generous and represents exactly the kind of opportunity I have been seeking since I arrived in America. However, I have already committed to working with Rothschild Capital Management as their Senior Vice President of International Development, and I believe in honoring my commitments regardless of what other opportunities may arise. Mr. Rothschild took a chance on me when no one else would, and I intend to prove that his faith in me was justified." The response surprised everyone in the room, including Evandro, who had expected Viviane to accept the Goldman Sachs offer without hesitation. In a world where financial professionals routinely moved between firms for better compensation and opportunities, her decision to honor her commitment to Rothschild Capital demonstrated a level of integrity that was increasingly rare on Wall Street. Marcus Steinberg nodded with respect, understanding that Viviane's loyalty and character were exactly the qualities that made her so valuable as a professional and as a person. The Goldman Sachs meeting concluded with an agreement that not only restored Rothschild Capital's credit lines, but also established a strategic partnership between the two firms, with Viviane serving as the primary liaison for all Eastern European and African sovereign debt transactions. The partnership would generate millions of dollars in revenue for both companies and establish Viviane as one of the most influential professionals in international finance. But more importantly, it would provide opportunities for other immigrants and people of color who had been overlooked by the traditional Wall Street establishment. 6 months later, Viviane stood in the same penthouse where she had once cleaned toilets for $15 an hour. But now she was there as an invited guest at a celebration honoring her selection as Financial Professional of the Year by the International Banking Association. She wore an elegant black dress that she had purchased with her first bonus check, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had not only rebuilt her career, but had exceeded every goal she had set for herself when she first arrived in America. The celebration was attended by the most powerful people in international finance, men and women who managed trillions of dollars in assets and whose decisions affected economies around the world. But among all these influential guests, Viviane was the center of attention, not just because of her professional accomplishments, but because of the story she represented. The journey from invisible housekeeper to respected leader that challenged everyone's assumptions about worth, potential, and the American dream. During the evening, Evandro approached Viviane with an expression of genuine humility that she had never seen from him before. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 8 months of reflection and personal growth. "When you first told us about your background, I was angry not just because you had kept it secret, but because it forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about myself and how I treated people. I realized that I had spent my entire life believing that wealth and status made me better than other people, that my success meant I was somehow more deserving of respect and opportunity than people who struggled financially." He paused, looking around the room at the celebration that was taking place in honor of someone he had once treated as invisible. "But watching you over these past months, seeing how you've handled success with grace and humility, seeing how you've used your position to create opportunities for other people who have been overlooked, I've learned something important about real worth and real character. You didn't just save my company. You saved me from becoming someone I would have been ashamed to be." Viviane listened to Evandro's words with the same compassion she had shown him during the crisis that brought them together, understanding that personal growth often comes through painful recognition of our own shortcomings. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "But you should know that I don't hold any anger toward you or Augusta for how you treated me initially. You treated me the way society taught you to treat people in my position, and it took extraordinary circumstances for you to see beyond those assumptions. What matters is not how we started, but how we choose to treat each other going forward." The conversation was interrupted by Augusta, who approached with tears in her eyes and an expression of overwhelming gratitude. "Viviane, she said. "I need you to know how much you've changed not just our company, but our entire family. Bradford has decided to study international relations because he was inspired by your story about helping governments and making a difference in the world. Regina has started volunteering with refugee resettlement organizations because she wants to help people who are going through what you went through when you first arrived in America. And I've established a scholarship fund for immigrant women pursuing careers in finance, because I want to make sure that other women like you don't have to clean houses while they wait for someone to recognize their potential." The scholarship fund Augusta mentioned had grown into a multi-million-dollar foundation that provided not just financial assistance, but mentoring, networking opportunities, and internships for immigrant women who wanted to break into the financial industry. Viviane served on the board of directors and personally interviewed scholarship recipients, sharing her story not as a tale of individual triumph, but as evidence of the untapped potential that exists in communities that have been marginalized and overlooked by traditional power structures. But perhaps the most meaningful moment of the evening came when Viviane was approached by a young African woman named Keisha Washington, who had been hired as an analyst at Rothschild Capital Management through the diversity initiative that Viviane had established. "Miss Nakamura," Keisha said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I want you to know that I almost gave up on my dream of working in finance because I couldn't get anyone to take me seriously. I was working as a waitress while I sent out resumes that nobody responded to, and I was starting to believe that maybe I wasn't smart enough or good enough for this industry. But then I heard your story, and I realized that the problem wasn't with me. It was with a system that didn't know how to recognize talent when it came in a package they weren't expecting." Viviane hugged Keisha tightly, seeing in this young woman the same determination and potential that she had carried within herself during those dark months of cleaning houses and sleeping in a basement room. "Your success is not just about you," she whispered to Keisha. "Every time you excel in this industry, every time you demonstrate your competence and integrity, you're opening doors for the next young woman who looks like us and dreams like us. Never forget that you carry the hopes of people who haven't even been born yet, and that your achievements today are making their dreams possible tomorrow." As the evening progressed, Viviane found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Not just the professional achievements, but the personal growth that had come through adversity and triumph. She thought about the morning 8 months earlier when she had woken up in her basement room, praying for strength to endure another day of being treated as invisible. She thought about the moment of decision when she chose to speak up, despite knowing that it might result in losing her job, and the courage it had taken to reveal her true qualifications to people who had never bothered to ask about her background. But most of all, she thought about the faith that had sustained her through the darkest period of her life, the belief that God had not forgotten her, and that her suffering was preparing her for a purpose greater than she could imagine. Standing in that penthouse, surrounded by the most powerful people in finance who were celebrating her achievements, she understood that her story was not just about personal success, but about the responsibility that comes with being given a platform to create change. During her acceptance speech for the Financial Professional of the Year award, Viviane spoke directly to the camera, knowing that her words would be heard by millions of people around the world who were struggling with their own challenges and dreams. To everyone watching this who feels invisible, who feels like your talents are not being recognized, who feels like you're stuck in circumstances that don't reflect your true potential, I want you to know that your current situation is not your final destination. God sees you, even when other people don't. Your struggles are not punishment. They are preparation. Your setbacks are not permanent. They are setups for comebacks that will astound everyone who doubted you. She paused, looking directly into the camera with the same intensity she had brought to every challenge in her career. I want you to understand that the people who treat you as if you're invisible are not the ones who determine your worth. Your value does not decrease based on other people's inability to see it. Keep developing your skills, keep preparing for opportunities that haven't come yet. Keep believing in yourself even when no one else believes in you. Because when your moment comes, and it will come, you want to be ready to seize it with both hands and show the world what you're truly capable of achieving. The speech was viewed over 10 million times within the first week after it was posted online, and Viviane began receiving messages from people around the world who had been inspired by her story to persevere through their own challenges. She heard from immigrants who had given up on their professional dreams and decided to try again, from women who had accepted positions below their qualifications and were now advocating for better opportunities, from young people who had been discouraged by rejection and were finding the courage to keep pursuing their goals. But among all the messages she received, the one that meant the most came from her former colleague in Switzerland, Dr. Helena Müller, who had worked with Viviane during her years at Swiss Banking Corporation and had witnessed firsthand the expertise and leadership that made her so successful in international finance. Helena's message was brief but powerful. Viviane, I always knew that your temporary setback would become the foundation for your greatest comeback. You have not just rebuilt your career, you have used your experience to create opportunities for others and to challenge systems that have kept talented people on the margins. Your mother would be proud of the woman you have become and the legacy you are building. The mention of her mother brought tears to Viviane's eyes, as she remembered the woman who had taught her that faith and character were more valuable than any material possession, that treating others with dignity and respect was more important than achieving personal success, and that true strength came not from avoiding difficulty, but from maintaining integrity and compassion while overcoming challenges that seemed impossible to survive. 1 year after the crisis that changed everything, Viviane was invited to speak at Harvard Business School, returning to the institution where she had earned her MBA 20 years earlier, as a young woman full of dreams and ambitions for making a difference in international finance. She stood at the podium looking out at an auditorium filled with graduate students who represented the future leaders of the global economy. Young men and women who would go on to manage trillions of dollars and make decisions that would affect millions of lives. But instead of talking about financial strategies or market analysis, Viviane chose to speak about something far more important: the moral responsibility that comes with power and privilege, and the danger of creating systems that judge people based on their circumstances rather than their character and capabilities. She told them about the 8 months she spent cleaning houses while qualified to manage billion-dollar portfolios, about the assumptions and prejudices that kept her invisible to the very people who desperately needed her expertise. Most importantly, she challenged them to examine their own assumptions about worth and potential, to look beyond the surface characteristics that society teaches us to use as shortcuts for determining someone's value. The person serving your coffee might be a former engineer, she told them. The woman cleaning your office might have advanced degrees and decades of professional experience. The man driving your taxi might speak 5 languages and understand international markets better than most Wall Street analysts. Never let someone's current circumstances blind you to their true potential and capabilities. After her speech, Viviane was approached by a young woman named Maria Santos, a first-year MBA student who had immigrated to the United States from El Salvador and was struggling to find internship opportunities despite her excellent academic performance. Maria's story was heartbreakingly familiar to Viviane: brilliant, qualified, hardworking, but overlooked because of assumptions about her background and accent. Forced to work multiple jobs to pay for school while watching less qualified classmates land prestigious positions through family connections and networks she had no access to. Viviane spent the next hour talking with Maria, sharing not just encouragement but practical advice about navigating the challenges that immigrant professionals face in American business culture. She connected Maria with contacts at Rothschild Capital Management and Goldman Sachs, who were specifically looking for diverse talent, and she invited her to attend networking events where she could meet other professionals who had overcome similar challenges in their careers. But more than providing professional assistance, Viviane wanted Maria to understand that her struggles were not a reflection of her inadequacy, but evidence of systemic barriers that could be overcome through persistence, preparation, and the support of people who understood her journey. Your accent is not a weakness, she told Maria. It's evidence that you're multilingual and multicultural, qualities that are incredibly valuable in international finance. Your immigrant background is not a disadvantage. It's proof that you have courage, resilience, and the ability to adapt to new environments, exactly the characteristics that make successful leaders in global markets. 6 months later, Maria graduated at the top of her MBA class and accepted a position as an associate at Goldman Sachs, where she worked under Viviane's mentorship in the International Sovereign Debt Division. Her success story became another example of the ripple effects created when someone with influence chooses to use their platform to create opportunities for others who have been overlooked and underestimated by traditional power structures. The transformation in Viviane's life had created not just personal success, but a movement that challenged the financial industry to reconsider how it identified and developed talent. The diversity initiatives she established at Rothschild Capital Management became a model that was adopted by other firms, creating pathways for immigrants, women, and people of color who had previously been excluded from opportunities in investment banking and asset management. But perhaps the most significant change was in Viviane herself. The woman who had once felt invisible and powerless had discovered that her greatest strength came not from her financial expertise, but from her ability to see potential in others that they could not see in themselves, to provide encouragement and opportunity to people who had been dismissed and overlooked just as she had been. 2 years after the crisis that changed everything, Viviane was featured on the cover of Forbes magazine as one of the most influential women in finance. But the article focused not just on her professional achievements, but on her commitment to creating systemic change in an industry that had historically excluded people who didn't fit traditional profiles of success. The cover photo showed her in her office at Rothschild Capital Management, surrounded by young professionals from diverse backgrounds who had been hired through the programs she had established. In the interview, Viviane reflected on the journey that had brought her from cleaning toilets to commanding respect at the highest levels of international finance. People often ask me if I'm angry about the 8 months I spent working as a housekeeper despite my qualifications, she said. But I've come to understand that those 8 months were not wasted time. They were preparation for understanding how our society treats people who are struggling, how easy it is to become invisible when you don't fit people's expectations, and how much talent and potential we overlook because of our assumptions and prejudices. She continued, "That experience gave me empathy and perspective that I never would have gained if my transition to America had been smooth and easy. It taught me that success without compassion is meaningless, that achievement without using your platform to help others is selfish, and that true leadership means creating opportunities for people who haven't been given the chances they deserve. I wouldn't change anything about my journey because it made me who I am today, and it prepared me to make a difference that goes far beyond my own career and financial success." The Forbes article sparked a national conversation about talent recognition, diversity in corporate leadership, and the barriers that prevent qualified professionals from accessing opportunities that match their skills and experience. Viviane was invited to testify before Congress about immigration policy and workforce development, to speak at economic summits about inclusive capitalism, and to advise Fortune 500 companies about creating more equitable hiring and promotion practices. But among all these high-profile opportunities, the moments that meant the most to Viviane were the quiet conversations with individuals who reached out to share their own stories of struggle and perseverance. She heard from a Haitian doctor who was driving for Uber while studying to pass American medical licensing exams, from a former Syrian telecommunications engineer who was working in a grocery store while learning American technology standards, from countless women and men whose expertise was being wasted because systems designed to identify talent were not equipped to recognize potential in people who didn't match traditional profiles. Each of these conversations reminded Viviane of the responsibility that came with her platform and influence, the obligation to use her success not just for personal advancement, but for creating change that would benefit people she would never meet, future generations of immigrants and outsiders who deserve the same opportunities to contribute their talents to American society. 3 years after the crisis that transformed her life, Viviane established the Nakamura Foundation for Immigrant Professional Development, a nonprofit organization that provided comprehensive support for highly qualified immigrants who were struggling to rebuild their careers in America. The foundation offered not just financial assistance, but mentoring, networking opportunities, credential recognition services, and advocacy for policy changes that would make it easier for immigrant professionals to contribute their skills to the American economy. The foundation's work attracted international attention and support from governments, corporations, and individuals who recognized that immigrant talent represented an underutilized resource that could drive innovation and economic growth if properly supported and developed. Within 2 years, the foundation had helped over 5,000 immigrant professionals secure positions that matched their qualifications, generating millions of dollars in economic value while transforming lives and families that had been struggling in survival mode. But the foundation was about more than just individual success stories. It was about changing the narrative around immigration and professional development, challenging the assumption that immigrants should be grateful for any work, regardless of their qualifications, and advocating for systems that recognized and utilized the full spectrum of talent that came to America seeking opportunity and contributing to economic growth. Viviane's work with the foundation brought her into contact with immigrant professionals from every continent and every field of expertise. Doctors who were driving taxis, engineers who were working in restaurants, teachers who were cleaning offices, lawyers who were doing manual labor, all because their credentials and experience were not recognized or valued by systems that prioritized networks and connections over competence and character. Each story reinforced her understanding that her own experience had been part of a much larger pattern of wasted human potential, systemic barriers that prevented qualified people from contributing their skills to society, and missed opportunities for innovation and growth that occurred when talent was overlooked because it came in unexpected packages or from unfamiliar backgrounds. 5 years after the morning when she first spoke up in Evandro's office, Viviane was invited to deliver the keynote address at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, speaking to an audience of global leaders about the economic and moral imperatives of inclusive talent development. She stood at the podium looking out at prime ministers and presidents, CEOs and central bank governors, thought leaders and policymakers who had the power to create systemic change that would affect millions of lives. Her speech that day focused on a simple but powerful concept, that every society's greatest untapped resource was the potential that existed in people who had been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed because of their circumstances, background, or appearance. She challenged the audience to consider how much innovation and economic growth was being lost, because systems for identifying and developing talent were not equipped to recognize competence and capability when it existed outside traditional networks and profiles. The person cleaning your hotel room tonight might be a former university professor, she told the audience. The woman serving your coffee this morning might have managed multi-million-dollar budgets in her home country. The man driving your taxi might understand international markets better than many of the analysts working for your investment firms. The question is not whether this talent exists. The question is whether we have the wisdom and courage to create systems that can identify, develop, and utilize the full spectrum of human potential that surrounds us every day. The speech was broadcast live to over 50 million viewers worldwide and sparked conversations in boardrooms, government offices, and academic institutions about the economic costs of discrimination and the competitive advantages that could be gained by organizations and countries that learn to recognize and develop talent regardless of its source or packaging. But for Viviane, the most meaningful response came from individuals who reached out to share how her story had inspired them to persevere through their own challenges, to maintain faith in their abilities despite rejection and setbacks, and to continue preparing for opportunities that hadn't yet materialized, but that they believed would eventually come. One message came from a young woman in Nigeria named Grace Okafor, who had been following Viviane's career since the Forbes article and had been inspired to pursue her own dreams of working in international finance, despite the barriers she faced as a woman in a male-dominated field in a developing country. Ms. Nakamura, Grace wrote, "Your story has taught me that setbacks are not permanent and that rejection does not define my worth or potential. I am studying for my CFA certification while working full-time to support my family, and I know that someday I will have the opportunity to contribute to global financial markets, just as you have done. Thank you for showing me that dreams delayed are not dreams denied. Another message came from Carlos Mendoza, a former mechanical engineer from Venezuela who had been working as a dishwasher in Miami while studying to pass American engineering certification exams. Your speech at Davos gave me hope during the darkest period of my life, when I was beginning to doubt whether I would ever be able to use my engineering skills again. You reminded me that my current job does not define my capabilities, and that every day I spend preparing for better opportunities is an investment in a future that I cannot yet see, but that I must continue to believe in. These messages, and thousands like them, reminded Viviane that her story had transcended her own individual experience and had become a symbol of hope for people around the world who were struggling to rebuild their lives and careers in the face of systemic barriers and personal challenges that seemed insurmountable. 10 years after the crisis that changed everything, Viviane was appointed as the first African-born woman to serve on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, a position that gave her influence over monetary policy that affected not just the American economy, but global financial markets. Her appointment was controversial among some traditional financial establishment figures, who questioned whether someone with her unconventional career path was qualified for such a critical role. But it was enthusiastically supported by economists, business leaders, and policymakers who recognized that her unique combination of technical expertise and real-world understanding of economic inequality made her exactly the kind of voice that was needed in American financial leadership. During her confirmation hearings before the Senate Banking Committee, Viviane was asked by Senator Patricia Williams about how her experience as a housekeeper had prepared her for a role in setting national monetary policy. Her answer became one of the most quoted responses in Senate confirmation history. "Senator Williams," she said, "my 8 months working as a housekeeper taught me more about the real economy than any textbook or academic conference ever could. I learned what it feels like when monetary policy affects real people's lives, when interest rate decisions determine whether someone can afford rent or whether a family can buy groceries. I learned that behind every economic statistic is a human being with hopes, dreams, fears, and responsibilities. My experience cleaning houses didn't just prepare me to understand data about unemployment or wage growth. It prepared me to remember that our decisions at the Federal Reserve affect real people in real communities who deserve economic policies that give them opportunities to build better lives for themselves and their families." The response was met with sustained applause from the gallery, and the video of her testimony was viewed over 20 million times within 48 hours, inspiring discussions about the value of diverse perspectives in economic leadership and the importance of including voices from all segments of society in decisions that affect everyone's financial well-being. As a Federal Reserve governor, Viviane championed policies that promoted financial inclusion, supported small business development in underserved communities, and created pathways for economic mobility that had previously been blocked by systemic barriers. Her work on the Fed focused particularly on ensuring that monetary policy considered not just aggregate economic indicators, but the lived experiences of working families, immigrants, and communities that had historically been excluded from economic opportunity. But perhaps her most significant contribution was her advocacy for what she called talent-based economic development, the idea that America's competitive advantage in the global economy depended on its ability to identify, develop, and utilize human potential, regardless of where it originated or how it was packaged. She argued that countries and organizations that learn to recognize talent in unexpected places would have significant advantages over those that continued to rely on traditional networks and conventional indicators of potential. Her work at the Federal Reserve brought her into contact with economic leaders from around the world, and she used these relationships to promote international cooperation on issues of financial inclusion, immigrant integration, and workforce development. She became a leading voice in global discussions about how economic policies could be designed to maximize human potential, rather than simply optimizing aggregate growth indicators that might not reflect improvements in individual opportunity and quality of life. 15 years after the morning when she first revealed her qualifications to Evandro and Augusta, Viviane published her memoir, Invisible No More, A Journey from Housekeeper to Hope, which became an international bestseller and inspired millions of readers around the world who were facing their own challenges with discrimination, setbacks, and dreams that seemed impossible to achieve. The book was more than just a personal success story. It was a call to action for individuals, organizations, and societies to examine their assumptions about worth and potential, to create systems that could recognize talent in all its forms, and to build economies that maximized human potential rather than wasting it through prejudice, discrimination, and narrow definitions of success. In the final chapter of her memoir, Viviane reflected on the journey that had taken her from a basement room in Queens to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, from cleaning toilets to influencing global economic policy, from being invisible to becoming a voice for millions of people who continue to struggle for recognition and opportunity. I wrote this book not to celebrate my own success, but to honor the struggles and dreams of everyone who has ever felt invisible, overlooked, or underestimated because of their circumstances, background, or appearance. My story is not unique. It is representative of millions of people around the world who possess talents, skills, and potential that our societies have not yet learned to recognize and develop. The question is not whether this potential exists. The question is whether we will have the wisdom and courage to create systems that can identify it, nurture it, and allow it to flourish for the benefit of everyone. She continued, I want every person reading this to understand that your current circumstances do not define your potential, that rejection does not determine your worth, and that dreams delayed are not dreams denied. Keep preparing for opportunities that haven't come yet. Keep developing skills that others might not recognize today, but that will be essential tomorrow. Keep believing in yourself even when others cannot see what you see in your own future. Because when your moment comes, and it will come, you want to be ready to seize it with both hands and show the world what you were always capable of achieving. The memoir's success led to speaking engagements around the world, where Viviane continued to share her message of hope, perseverance, and the transformative power of recognizing human potential in unexpected places. She spoke to audiences of business leaders about the competitive advantages of inclusive hiring practices, to government officials about the economic benefits of immigrant integration, to students about the importance of character and integrity in professional success, and to anyone who would listen about the moral imperative of treating every person with dignity and respect regardless of their current circumstances. But among all her achievements and recognition, the moments that continued to mean the most to Viviane were the personal conversations with individuals who approached her after speeches, wrote letters sharing their own struggles and dreams, or simply wanted to thank her for proving that it was possible to overcome seemingly impossible barriers through faith, hard work, and unwavering belief in one's own potential. 20 years after the crisis that changed everything, Viviane stood once again in the penthouse where her transformation had begun. But this time, she was there for a very different kind of celebration. Evandro and Augusta had invited her to mark the 20th anniversary of Rothschild Capital Management's partnership with Goldman Sachs, the relationship that had grown out of the debt crisis she had solved and had generated billions of dollars in revenue for both firms over the past 2 decades. The celebration was attended by hundreds of financial professionals, government officials, and community leaders who had been touched by Viviane's work over the years. But the guest who meant the most to her was a young woman named Destiny Johnson, a recent graduate of the Harvard Business School scholarship program that had been established with funds from the Nakamura Foundation, who had just accepted a position as an analyst at Rothschild Capital Management. Destiny's story was remarkably similar to Viviane's: brilliant, qualified, hard-working, but initially overlooked because of assumptions about her background and potential. She had grown up in poverty in Detroit, had worked multiple jobs to pay for college, and had been rejected by dozens of firms before being discovered through the Foundation's Talent Identification Program. Now she stood in the same penthouse where Viviane had once cleaned toilets, representing the next generation of leaders who would continue the work of creating opportunities for people whose potential had been overlooked by traditional systems. As Viviane looked around the room at the celebration of everything that had grown out of that terrible morning 20 years earlier, she reflected on the journey that had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of thousands of people who had been touched by the opportunities and programs that had grown out of her experience. She thought about Grace Okafor, who had become one of Nigeria's most successful investment bankers, Carlos Mendoza, who had started his own engineering firm that employed dozens of immigrant professionals, Maria Santos, who had become a managing director at Goldman Sachs and was now mentoring the next generation of Latina women in finance. She thought about the scholarship recipients who had gone on to successful careers in business, government, and nonprofit organizations, the immigrant professionals who had been able to rebuild their careers with dignity and respect, the companies that had discovered new sources of innovation and competitive advantage by learning to recognize talent in unexpected places, the policies that had been changed to create more equitable systems for credentialing and professional development. Most of all, she thought about the millions of people around the world who had been inspired by her story to persevere through their own challenges, to maintain faith in their abilities despite rejection and setbacks, and to continue preparing for opportunities that hadn't yet materialized, but that they believed would eventually come. During her remarks that evening, Viviane spoke directly to the young professionals in the audience who were just beginning their careers, knowing that they would face their own challenges and setbacks as they worked to build meaningful lives and make positive contributions to society. To everyone in this room who is starting out in your career, who is facing rejection or disappointment, who is struggling to be seen and recognized for your true potential, I want you to remember that success is not about avoiding failure. It is about learning from failure and using it to become stronger and more resilient. Every no you receive is preparing you for the yes that will change your life. Every setback you endure is teaching you lessons that you will need for the breakthrough that is coming. Every moment when you feel invisible or overlooked is building the character and empathy that will make you a better leader when your time comes. She paused, looking around the room at faces that represented every continent, every background, every possible path to success, united by their shared commitment to excellence and their determination to create opportunities for others. But most importantly, remember that success without service is empty, that achievement without compassion is meaningless, and that true leadership means using whatever platform and influence you gain to create opportunities for people who haven't been given the chances they deserve. Never forget where you came from, never lose sight of the struggles that brought you to where you are, and never stop believing that every person you meet has something valuable to contribute if you give them the chance to show you what they're capable of achieving. The speech concluded with a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. But for Viviane, the real reward was not the applause, but the knowledge that her story had become part of a larger narrative about human potential, social justice, and the transformative power of recognizing that every person has dignity, worth, and capabilities that deserve to be seen, developed, and celebrated. As the evening concluded and the guests began to leave, Viviane found herself alone in the penthouse for a few moments, standing in the same spot where she had first revealed her qualifications to Evandro and Augusta 20 years earlier. She closed her eyes and whispered the same prayer she had said every morning during those difficult months when she was working as a housekeeper. Dear God, thank you for never forgetting me. Thank you for using my pain for your purpose. Thank you for allowing me to be an instrument of hope for people who are struggling as I once struggled. Help me to never forget the lessons you taught me during that difficult time, and give me the wisdom and courage to continue using whatever influence you have given me to create opportunities for people who need them most. When she opened her eyes, she saw Destiny Johnson waiting by the elevator, and she walked over to join the young woman who represented everything she had been working toward for the past 20 years. Are you ready to change the world? Viviane asked with a smile, knowing that Destiny's journey was just beginning, and that she would face her own challenges and opportunities in the years ahead. I learned from the best, Destiny replied, her voice carrying the same quiet confidence that Viviane had developed during her own journey from invisible housekeeper to influential leader and I promise that I will never forget the responsibility that comes with the opportunities I've been given. As they rode down in the elevator together, Viviane reflected on the truth that had sustained her through every challenge and triumph of the past 20 years. That no one is ever truly invisible as long as they continue to believe in their own worth and potential. That setbacks are temporary, but character is permanent, and that the greatest success comes not from what we achieve for ourselves, but from what we make possible for others. The story that began with a desperate African immigrant sleeping in a basement room and cleaning toilets for survival had become a testament to the power of faith, perseverance, and the transformative potential that exists in every person who refuses to accept that their current circumstances define their ultimate destiny. And as Viviane walked out into the New York night, surrounded by the lights of a city that had once seemed so unwelcoming, but had ultimately become the place where her greatest dreams came true, she knew that the most important chapters of her story were still being written by the lives she had touched and the opportunities she had created for others to write their own stories of hope, transformation, and triumph. If you've been inspired by Viviane's incredible journey from invisible housekeeper to Federal Reserve Governor, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more amazing stories of hope, transformation, and the power of never giving up on your dreams. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their current circumstances are not their final destination. And remember that every person you meet has a story worth knowing and potential worth recognizing.